They say cold kills fast, but that's only half the truth. Out here, cold decides who dies. The bullets just carry out the verdict. I first saw a man freeze to death standing up, boots locked in the snow, eyes open like he was still watching the horizon. His rifle was still in his hands. I remember wondering if I should salute. My name is Arvo Lehtinen, born 1917, the same year we ripped ourselves out of Russia's hands and called it a nation. A farm boy from Kivijärvi, which is a place made mostly of pine trees, mosquitoes, and silence. My father once said if the Russians ever came back, we'd fight them with shovels if we had to. Turns out we almost did. I was 22 when the Winter War started. November 30th, 1939. The Red Army crossed the border, claiming they needed security from Germany. What they meant was, they wanted Karelia back and the rest of us on our knees. We weren't supposed to win. They had tanks, bombers, thousands of men for every 100 of ours. We had skis, old rifles, and cold. God, we had the cold. By mid-December, I was in a unit near Suomussalmi, up north where the snow eats your breath. Our orders were simple: slow them down, hold the road. We were short on ammunition and long on desperation. Most of us wore civilian clothes under our snow camo. My boots were 2 sizes too big, stuffed with newspaper. My commander was Lieutenant Tervo, a one-eyed veteran of our Civil War. He liked to say things like, "If you're going to freeze to death, do it somewhere the enemy can trip over your corpse." He was also the first man I saw shot through the stomach. The Soviets came in columns, long and proud, tanks grinding the forest edge like they didn't know trees could fight back. Our ski patrols harassed them day and night, slicing their supply lines, setting traps. We became ghosts in the pines. One evening I met Simo Häyhä. Yes, that Simo, the White Death. He didn't look like a legend. He looked like a farmer who'd been left alone too long, barely spoke, but his rifle was always clean, and his eyes never blinked when you mentioned Soviets. He handed me half a loaf of frozen rye bread, nodded once, and vanished into the trees. A week later, I watched 2 Russians drop dead through my scope. No sound, just red blooming across their coats. Simo, I thought. In early January, we ambushed a Soviet column at night, the kind they said was heading toward Raiate Road. Flames lit the forest. I remember the shadows of men burning as clearly as I remember my mother's hands. We lost Raimo that night, my closest friend. He slipped trying to flank a tank, cracked his head on a rock. Didn't even get to fire. I carried his body back on a sled we stole from a village barn. He was 20, still had a milk tooth. We burned what the Soviets left behind: boots, papers, food. I found a harmonica in a captain's coat pocket. Played it for the boys once. We didn't laugh, but we didn't cry either. That was the closest we came to celebration. In late January, I was pulled from the line for a resupply run south. That's when I met Field Marshal Mannerheim. Not directly, just close enough to see him at a field post, inspecting maps with a cigarette in hand. Everyone stood a little straighter, even the trees, I swear. He didn't give speeches, just nodded, calm as ice. Later, someone said he'd told the staff, "We may be outnumbered, but not outwilled." We believed him. By March, we were being pushed back. The Soviets brought in fresh men. Our boots were worn, rifles frozen, stomachs empty. Still, we held. The Treaty of Moscow came on March 13th. We lost land, huge parts of Karelia, but we kept our country. I returned home with lice in my beard and frostbite in my toes, but alive. Everyone called us heroes, but when I looked in the mirror, all I saw was the snow and the shadows that never left it. When the Winter War ended, we didn't cheer. We limped home, bruised and quiet, and tried to forget that the Soviets had taken a piece of Finland with them and left 1,000 pieces behind. We lost 11% of our territory in the treaty. Places like Viipuri, Sala, and the Karelian Isthmus, gone. That meant 400,000 Finns suddenly found themselves homeless. Entire families bundled their lives onto sleighs and trucks, moving west into a Finland that already had too little space and even less comfort. I returned to Kivijärvi to find the barn half collapsed and my father coughing blood into a cloth he tried to hide. He died in May. We buried him in soil still frozen under 2 inches of thaw. My mother didn't say a word the whole day, just stood staring east, toward land that was no longer ours. I tried to go back to being a farmer, but my hands were too used to metal, my sleep too shallow, and the trees too quiet. I'd wake in the middle of the night expecting artillery, and get only the distant bark of foxes. I thought about Raimo often. I kept the harmonica I'd found in the Russian officer's coat, even though I never played it again. It felt like an artifact of a man I couldn't become anymore. But war doesn't ask if you're ready. It only asks if you're still breathing. By late 1940, the world was at war again, Germany rolling through Europe like thunder. And Finland? Finland was stranded, betrayed by the West, scarred by the East, and full of men who weren't done fighting. Some called it bitterness, others called it honor. Me? I called it unfinished business. The Germans approached us quietly at first. They needed allies for their eastern plans. We were suddenly useful again, not quite friends, but not enemies either. They called it co-belligerence. We called it revenge. By spring 1941, Finnish divisions were rearming, training again. We didn't say it aloud, but we knew what was coming. Another war, and this time we'd take the fight back across the border. I re-enlisted that June, not because I hated Russians. I didn't, not even after all they'd taken. I re-enlisted because I couldn't stand doing nothing, because I wanted my land back, because Raimo still haunted my dreams. I was assigned to the Infantry Regiment 61, part of the reserves near Kekisalmi. It was there I met Lauri Törni. He was lean, fast-talking, always carrying a map and a plan. Not the kind of man you expected to be a legend until you saw him lead a patrol through enemy woods like he had grown from the roots themselves. The Russians called him the Terror of the East. We just called him Törni. He looked at me once after a long night op and said, "You survived Suomussalmi. Then you're made of the right stuff, or you're already dead inside. Either way, we need you." I liked him immediately. While the Germans prepared Operation Barbarossa, we Finns prepared too, watching the sky, listening to the east. The air buzzed with tension. You could feel it in your skin, like the moment before a snowstorm. The continuation of the war became inevitable, and when it came, it would come with fire. I still had my old rifle, still had the same boots, stitched and restitched by my mother's hands. I said goodbye to her again, this time with less ceremony. She didn't cry. She just gave me a hard piece of rye bread, kissed my forehead and said, "If the Russians don't kill you, the army soup might." I smiled, almost laughed. Then I walked to the truck that would take me back east. Behind me, the wind picked up, whistling through the birches like the whisper of ghosts. The wind smelled different in June, not like summer, but like something holding its breath. The lakes were calm, the birds sang, and yet every man I served beside knew we weren't at peace. We were waiting. On June 22nd, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, storming into Soviet territory with all the arrogance of lightning. Finland, careful as a fox near a bear's den, waited 3 more days. But when Soviet bombers struck Porvoo, Turku, and Helsinki on June 25th, we stopped pretending neutrality. Mannerheim declared this war wasn't for Germany, it was for Finland, to retake what had been lost. And so the continuation war began. I was deployed near Ilomantsi, the forests thick with rain and biting insects. I'd forgotten how a wet uniform clings to your skin like regret. But when the orders came, we pushed east, over the border we'd once bled to hold. We retook Ladoga Karelia quickly. Soviet resistance was fierce but disorganized. Some villages we passed were empty, others still smoldering from retreating fires. I saw churches without roofs, cows wandering without herds, and once a little girl sitting alone on a bench beside a ruined bakery. She didn't cry, she just stared. War makes statues of the living. In August, our unit joined the offensive toward Petrozavodsk, moving along the northern shore of Lake Onega. I skied 50 kilometers in 3 days with Törni's detachment on a flanking maneuver. The man could move through snow like a whisper. We struck a Soviet outpost on August 29th, cutting their communication lines and taking 12 prisoners, most of them wounded. One of them asked me in broken Finnish why we came back. I said, "Because you never left us in peace." He didn't argue. That fall we dug in. The front lines stabilized, but the blood did not stop. The Soviets counterattacked constantly, probing our positions near the Svir River, firing blindly into the trees. I lost a tooth to a grenade fragment and 3 friends in one afternoon to a minefield none of us knew was there. I grew used to the smell of cordite and wet socks. We'd sit by fire pits at night, passing around a tin of smoked fish, laughing at nothing. We told the same joke over and over. What's the difference between a Russian officer and a reindeer? The reindeer runs when it hears Finns. We all laughed, even when we didn't want to. By October, the snow returned. I woke up once with ice crusted on my eyebrows and frostbite crawling down my fingers. But it wasn't the cold that got us. It was the silence. The kind of silence that made you imagine every creak of a branch was a rifle bolt. That's when I saw Simo Häyhä again. He arrived to brief our sniper team. Still short, still pale, still quiet. But now men whispered around him like he was a ghost that answered to Finland alone. He shook my hand. I asked if he remembered me. He said, "I never forget the living. There are so few of us." That night I dreamed of white forests and red snow. In December we took positions outside Medvezhegorsk, where the lakes froze in perfect silence. The Germans wanted us to push farther, to take Leningrad from the north, but Mannerheim refused. This wasn't their war, not in that way, and for the first time I believed we might hold what we had won. But I also knew nothing stays still in war, not snow, not blood, not even hope. We weren't marching anymore. We were digging in, and the wind no longer whispered. It howled. By the first days of 1942, the snow had become a second skin. We were dug in along the Svir River, between Lake Ladoga and Lake Onega, a stretch of forest and marsh where the Soviets shelled us by day and sent scouts by night. Neither side had the strength for a major offensive. The war here wasn't movement anymore. It was endurance. We called it the waiting war. The cold crept into everything. It cracked your rifle oil. It froze your coffee mid-pour, and it slid between your thoughts like a knife. Men didn't go mad, not all at once, but they quieted. They forgot their own voices. I once watched a corporal sit outside a dugout for 3 hours, staring at a birch tree. When we asked what he was doing, he said, "Listening to the roots breathe." He was sent back home a week later. They said it was frostbite. We knew better. I tried to write letters to my mother, to my sister, who'd married a railway clerk in Jyväskylä, even to my old school teacher, just to feel like I remembered how to speak to someone who wasn't wearing a uniform. I wrote one to Raimo, too, folded it, sealed it, then burned it in the stove. He wouldn't have replied anyway. I carried a notebook, though, filled it with names, places, days I wanted to remember or forget. I wrote down the names of the men in my squad and crossed them out when they didn't come back from patrol. By March, 5 names were crossed out. By April, it was 9. One was Ilka, who sang opera in the trenches. One was Hanu, who'd brought me my first cigarette. One was Yuka, who asked me every week if I thought the war would end before next winter. He never got an answer. The Soviets shelled our position on April 9th, trying to test our lines. I saw 3 men catch fire from a fuel drum that exploded too close to the mess tent. Their screams were short. One of them was still chewing when the blast hit. I found a tooth in my boot 2 days later. I stopped writing letters after that. In May, Törni came through again, reorganizing long-range patrols, training volunteers for more aggressive operations behind enemy lines. He was different now, still sharp, still confident, but something colder in him, as if the forest had finally swallowed whatever warmth he once had. He asked me if I wanted to join a deep raid across the sphere, 2 weeks in enemy territory, cut off, operating in pairs. I declined. "I thought you were one of the stubborn ones," he said. "I am," I said. "That's why I'm still alive." He didn't smile. That summer the mosquitoes returned with a vengeance, and with them came the boredom and the guilt. Nothing gnaws at a soldier quite like surviving. I had lost count of how many letters I never sent, or how many I'd received but couldn't bring myself to open. I had one from my sister that I kept sealed in my chest pocket. The envelope was smudged from sweat. I never read it, just held it when the shelling got close. Some nights I'd stare at the northern sky, bright with auroras, and try to imagine what peace might look like. But it always blurred, like breath on glass. We were told the Soviets were planning something bigger, that this lull wouldn't last, that another storm was coming. We believed it. But no one said it out loud. Instead, we sharpened our knives. We cleaned our boots. We cleaned our rifles. And we waited. By the time autumn of 42 bled into winter again, I could no longer remember what warmth felt like without guilt. The fires we built in the dugout smoked too thick. You had to choose between heat or breathing. Men took turns sleeping so no one froze to death in the night. We lined our boots with newspapers, our coats with pine needles, anything to push the cold back another hour. But cold wasn't the enemy. Hope was. The officers still posted bulletins. Germany advancing on Stalingrad. Leningrad still surrounded. Victory is only a matter of time. We didn't believe them, not because they were lies, but because even if they were true, they weren't for us. We weren't advancing. We were rotting in the pines. Then came a new order. I was selected for a raiding patrol with 5 others, a cross-border mission into Soviet lines to sabotage a supply depot near Shelto Zero, deep in the forests beyond the sphere. We trained under one of Törni's junior officers, a cold-eyed corporal who called us ice wolves and told us to forget we ever had names. I didn't argue. We left December 11th, 1942. Skis, light rifles, knives, a single radio. We moved by moonlight, slept under branches, didn't light fires, ate dried reindeer meat and snow. By the 3rd day, we were all coughing blood from cold burns in our lungs. By the 5th, we found the depot, a crude log structure guarded by 20 men and 2 machine guns. We waited until night, slipped in, set charges. It went well until it didn't. We were spotted during exfiltration. One of ours, Väinö, took a bullet in the hip. I dragged him for a kilometer until he stopped talking, then another until he stopped breathing. I left him under a pine, his dog tag stuffed in his sock. I got frostbite on 3 fingers that night. 2 months later they turned black. The medic wanted to cut them off with a kitchen knife. I said I'd rather keep them as souvenirs. By January the weather turned worse. Storms every other day. I remember one night waking up in my dugout with snow piled so high the entrance was gone. I had to dig myself out like a grave robber. Found Ilmari, our new machine gunner, frozen half solid under the next tent, his hands still wrapped around his weapon like a cradle. We buried him with his mittens on. When February came, the Germans started whispering about Stalingrad, about the loss, about collapse. We weren't told directly. It just seeped into the camp like smoke under a door. The men got quieter, officers drank more. You could feel the war turning like a river changing course. That spring I found myself posted near Pitcairn, watching a Soviet patrol approach from the ridgeline. I didn't fire, just watched them. 6 men, tired, one limping. They looked like us, like mirror ghosts. I wondered if they saw me too, or if we were all already dead. In May 1943, Törni visited again. He spoke to the officers, gave them that clipped, sharp speech of his. "We hold the line, or we let them take everything." Some men clapped. I sat still. I respected him, but I no longer believed in lines. The snow didn't care who owned the border. That night I opened the letter from my sister. It was dated October 1942. It said our mother had died, that she was buried with a photo of me in her hands. I read it twice, then I folded it into my notebook, next to Raimo's name, next to Yuka's, next to the map I had sketched of where I left WWII. My list was getting longer, and I still hadn't written a word back. By the summer of 1943, I had stopped counting the days. I counted thaws. The first thaw meant your boots would sink instead of crack. The second meant you could sleep without your breath freezing to your face. The third meant flies and the stink of the war returning to the surface. The snow gave up its secrets slowly. First the boots, then the bones. I remember a melted foxhole near Kutilahti that opened up to reveal 2 Soviets still holding each other. One had a photo of a woman in his pocket, the ink bleeding into his skin. We buried them, said nothing, moved on. We were redeployed to the Maselka Isthmus near the borderlands between Karelia and Russian territory. It was higher ground dotted with bogs and black pine forests, the kind of place where a man could walk all day and end up right back where he started. We built new trenches, repaired old bunkers, laid new mines where the old ones had frozen and cracked. It was work, but it felt like digging into the past, like the ground beneath us remembered everything we wanted to forget. We were told Germany was weakening, though they still sent us supplies, weapons, medicine, even some SS advisors who looked at us like we were hill farmers with rifles, which, to be fair, we mostly were. But we knew the truth. We were alone again. In August, my squad got a new lieutenant, Nieminen, barely 20. University boy, glasses. Tried to make us run drills in perfect formation while we were ankle-deep in bog water. After a week he learned to listen more than speak. That saved his life when the shelling started. One night in September we were ordered to intercept a Soviet recon team that had crossed the line and was mapping our artillery positions. I led a 4-man unit, the kind of silent stalkers we'd all become. We moved through the wet woods under a moon so bright it felt like a lamp swinging above us. We found them near a stream, 5 men, young, exhausted, passing bread between them. One was playing a mouth harp. I waited, watched. Then I pulled the trigger. The others followed. It was over in under a minute. We checked the bodies. The boy with the harp had a sketchbook. Inside were drawings of lakes, trees, and the face of a girl smiling on a bench. We buried him upright. I didn't speak for 3 days after that. Winter came late that year, but when it came, it hit harder than before. The cold didn't just freeze your body, it froze time. You stopped thinking of victory. You thought only of warmth, of bread, of walking into the woods and never coming back. I found Ilka, the replacement machine gunner, one morning with his boots off and a smile on his face. He'd walked barefoot into the frost because he said he was tired of carrying the war on his toes. He didn't make it 100 meters. We stopped chasing men like that. Let them go. If death wanted them, who were we to argue? By March 1944, the shelling began again in earnest. The Soviets were shifting their strength westward. Rumors came fast and heavy of new offensives, of the Red Army breaking through in Ukraine, of Germany collapsing, of the Americans bombing everything. The world was catching fire again, but we were still here, still frozen, still waiting for the ground to move. One night I stood watch in a tower we'd patched together from fir trees and barbed wire. I looked out across no man's land, a flat, frozen expanse broken only by the shadows of old craters, and I realized we were no longer fighting for land. We were fighting for the space beneath our boots, the right to stand, to hold, to not be moved, even if the rest of the world had already left us behind. The line always breaks, not at once, but like ice under boots, a crack, a pause, then the plunge. June 9th, 1944, was the day everything changed. That morning, the Soviets launched an artillery barrage on the Karelian Isthmus that made the sky feel like it was screaming. Vyborg Bay to Lake Ladoga. The entire line shook. Over 300,000 Soviet troops surged forward in what they called the Vyborg-Petrozavodsk offensive. We just called it hell. I was transferred back south to reinforce our collapsing positions near Tali-Ihantala, the largest battle ever fought in Nordic history. I remember the train ride there. Half the men were barely out of school. One had brought a mandolin. He played quietly while the rest of us stared through the slats, wondering if we were being shipped to our deaths or our legacy. We dug in fast. Artillery rained down day and night. Trenches turned to slurry. Men drowned in shell holes before they could bleed out. I once watched a medic get vaporized mid-step. One moment there, the next, just mist and boots. June 25th, I was sent to scout a flank position outside Ihantala village. The forest was shredded, stumps smoking, birds gone. I moved alone, heard voices, crouched low. Then I saw them. Lauri Törni leading a detachment, ragged, thin, but eyes sharp as ever. He saw me, nodded. "Still alive, Lehtinen?" I said. "You're getting older. You're easier to find." He smirked, blood on his cheek, rifle slung like a shovel. We held that line for weeks, not because we were stronger, but because we refused to be erased. The German Stukas gave support, but barely. The real weapon was the land, the trees, the rocks, and the sheer hatred we held for letting this happen again. We fought with everything, artillery, Molotovs, sharpened sticks if we had to. One night I found myself bayoneting a man in a shell crater, both of us ankle-deep in water and blood, neither one saying a word, just breathing, just trying not to die. I lost 2 fingers that week, shot off when I reached for a wounded corporal. He didn't make it. I kept the glove, though, the hole in it like a second wound. By July 9th, we had repelled the Soviet breakthrough, barely. The lines had held, just, and at a cost we hadn't begun to measure. Mannerheim himself toured the front. I didn't see him, but I heard his words repeated from man to man. "We cannot win, but we must not lose." And in that riddle was our truth. The front stabilized, somehow. The Soviets paused their assault. Whether by choice, exhaustion, or greater focus on Germany, no one knew. We only knew we had bought time, and time in war is a kind of mercy. I sat one evening on a tree stump, boots off. the silence strange. A younger soldier asked me if I thought Finland would survive. I told him, "Finland isn't a flag. It's a memory of something we refuse to forget." He nodded, lit a cigarette, and started humming a hymn. We didn't know it then, but the Moscow armistice was only weeks away. The line had bent, buckled, but it hadn't snapped. Not yet. The war didn't end with trumpets. It ended with a shrug and a fire. In late August 1944, the Soviet artillery fell silent, almost as suddenly as it had begun. Rumors spread like lice in a winter coat. Peace talks, armistice, retreat. No one believed it at first. We thought it was a trick, some kind of Soviet game to lower our guard. But then we got the word. Mannerheim had replaced Ryti as president, and negotiations had opened with Moscow. On September 4th, our guns stopped. On September 5th, the Soviet guns stopped too. We didn't cheer. We didn't trust it. We just sat in our dugouts and smoked what was left of the German cigarettes. I remember staring at the frost in my rifle barrel, unsure whether to clean it or bury it. That night I watched a young soldier burn his boots, said he wouldn't need them anymore, said if the Russians came again, he'd meet them barefoot. He didn't laugh when he said it. No one did. The Moscow armistice was signed September 19th, 1944. The terms were harsh. Return to the 1940 borders, Side Petsamo, expel German forces, pay massive reparations. In exchange, peace. But it wasn't peace. Not really. Because now we had to turn on our former allies. The Lapland War began almost immediately. Finland had to expel the Germans, who had been our partners in blood for 3 years. They didn't leave quietly. They burned everything behind them. Scorched earth from Rovaniemi to the Arctic Ocean. I was sent north with the 11th Division. The forests we marched through had once saved us from Soviets. Now they smelled of diesel and betrayal. I saw Rovaniemi in flames, its church gutted, the sky lit like a funeral pyre. The Germans weren't shooting at us often, but they didn't need to. Their retreat was one long burn mark across Lapland. We fought a skirmish near Tankavara in October, a bitter exchange in snow-swept woods. They wore the same gray, used the same rifles. When one fell, I almost called out in Finnish before I remembered. We buried them under the same frost. There was no glory in this war, no good guys left, just the men who hadn't yet drowned in history's mud. In November, I was pulled off the line, transferred south. Paperwork duty, they said. But I knew what it was. A quiet thank you for surviving, for not going mad, for not deserting when I should have. I met a man there who'd served with Simo Häyhä, said the White Death had been wounded by a Soviet explosive round and left half his face behind in the snow. But he survived. He'd gone back to farming. They say he still doesn't talk much, the man said. Neither do the dead, I replied. One night in the barracks I lit a fire, threw my notebook into it, pages full of names, maps, thoughts too dark to remember, too real to forget. I watched the paper curl and blacken, like old snow melting, and I thought, maybe this is what peace feels like. A little fire, a little silence. But even then I knew better. Smoke only hides the scars. It never heals them. The road home wasn't a road at all. It was a march without orders, one foot in front of the other, across snow that looked just like the front, only colder because this time no one was watching. The Lapland War ended officially in April 1945, but most of us had stopped fighting before then. The Germans had slipped north into Norway, burning the last timber outposts as they went. Finland was now a country at peace on paper and hollowed out in spirit. They told us we were free men again, but no one said what that meant. I returned to Kivijärvi in May, walking the last few kilometers with a duffel slung over my shoulder, 3 fingers missing, and a silence in my chest that no hymn could replace. The farm was still there, smaller somehow, though nothing had changed but me. My sister was waiting. Her husband had been killed in a railway explosion the year before. She lived alone now with a boy who barely spoke and a house that creaked like it remembered too much. I offered to fix the roof. She offered a plate of bread and boiled potatoes. We didn't say much. What could we? At night I lay in the loft and stared at the beams. The silence in the countryside was different from the trenches. It wasn't holding its breath. It was just empty. I missed the way Ilka would hum when he shaved, the sound of boots in snow, the click of rifle bolts being checked before dawn. I missed men I barely knew and couldn't bear to remember. Some mornings I walked to the lake and skipped stones. I saw a boat pulled ashore and imagined Lauri Törni in it, vanishing into another war. Last I'd heard, he'd joined a German unit before the surrender. Some said he'd escaped west. Some said he was dead. I didn't ask. Finland began rebuilding, slowly. We gave up Petsamo, lost Sala again, paid reparations in timber, machinery, blood. Factories started up, veterans worked rail lines or disappeared into the woods. No one asked too many questions, especially not about what we'd done to our own, the Reds, the prisoners, the forgotten. Sometimes I saw faces in the crowd and wondered which side of the line they'd stood on. Sometimes I looked in the mirror and wondered the same thing. One evening I found my mother's grave, simple stone, no cross, just a name and 2 dates. I sat there for a long while, told her about Raimo, about Simo, about a photo of a Russian girl in a dead soldier's sketchbook, about the man I had become and the man I had not. The wind didn't answer. In June 1945, a local official offered me a job, war records mostly, filing names, matching reports to units. I took it. Not because I wanted to, but because someone had to remember who had walked into the snow and never come back. One day I opened a folder and found my own name, half-typed, listed as missing in action, 1942. For a moment I thought, maybe that's true. Maybe that version of me never came back. I left the file untouched, marked it unconfirmed, closed the drawer. There are 2 kinds of survivors, those who bury the war and those who carry it like a lantern in the dark, not because they want to, but because they know someone has to. I tried to bury it, for a while. After the war, I lived like a man with a borrowed body. I repaired barns, mended fences, repaired a neighbor's bicycle in exchange for bread and quiet. The country was rebuilding, fast, fierce, like it needed to outrun its own history. But history doesn't lose its grip so easily. Every so often someone would nod to me in town, call me a hero. I'd say nothing. If you call a man a hero enough times, he begins to wonder what he did wrong to deserve it. In 1948, I testified for a war commission reviewing prisoner reports. They asked if I'd ever seen mistreatment. I said I'd seen worse: starvation, frostbite, the human body turned inside out by artillery. Did I mistreat anyone? I survived, I said. That was enough. I moved south in 1952 after my sister remarried. I found work in a sawmill near Lahti, where the forest was thinner and the silence not so steep. I lived in a 1-room flat, read old newspapers, drank weak coffee, and wrote letters I never sent. Old habit. Sometimes I'd visit graves, not ones I knew, just the war cemeteries. I'd walk the rows and imagine the faces, the hands, the voices. I wondered if anyone remembered them anymore, if they had children, if they had dreams. I didn't even remember all the names in my own squad. In 1958, I heard that Lauri Törni had been killed in Vietnam, fighting under the name Larry Thorne, a soldier in 3 armies and never quite at peace. They said he died in a helicopter crash. I imagined him laughing at that. All the gunfire he dodged, only to fall from the sky. That same year, Simo Häyhä gave an interview, the first since the war. He was living quietly in Ruokolahti, raising cows and not saying much. I clipped the article, taped it to my kitchen wall. He had once told me he remembered every man he didn't kill. I understood that now. Time passed. The world changed. I watched Finland grow quiet, then prosperous, then proud. The wounds became museums. The ruins were turned into parks. The war faded, not gone, but tidied, made digestible for school books and speeches. But some of us still carried the unedited version. In 1970, I was invited to speak at a veterans event in Jyväskylä. I stood before a crowd of gray-haired men and wide-eyed teenagers. They asked what it was like, what it felt like. I told them it was cold, it was loud, it was long. And then I told them something else. History remembers generals. Statues remember battles. But only the living remember the fear, the stench, the quiet, the shaking in your gut before a patrol. We didn't fight to win. We fought not to disappear. And those who disappeared still walk beside us. Every day. I left the stage to silence, no applause. And somehow that felt more honest. Now I'm old. My knees ache before it rains. I still walk with a limp I earned somewhere near Petrozavodsk. I keep a harmonica in my drawer. I never play it. Sometimes I see the forest in my dreams, the frost, the rifle barrel, the boy from the sketchbook. And sometimes I see Raimo leaning on a birch tree, smirking at me like we're still 20 and haven't yet learned what it means to come home. I'm not afraid to die. I've done it once already. Somewhere in the snow, I left the man who was young and angry and full of fire. What's left of me now is quieter, still, like the lakes before winter. They call us the lost generation. But we're not lost. We're the ones who remember. And if you're listening now, then so will you.